The invoice written in blood. Hollywood has sold you a lie. For decades, we've been fed the same image, a dark, dusty pit where disposable slaves are thrown onto the sand to hack each other apart, while a bloodthirsty mob screams for more. We see the thumbs down, we see the final blow, and we assume that death was the whole point. But if you want to understand the Roman Coliseum, you have to stop looking at the swords and start looking at the ledgers. Because underneath the gore and the glory, the arena ran on a cold, calculating financial logic that had almost nothing to do with bloodlust and everything to do with return on investment. Here's the number that changes everything. If a gladiator died in the arena, the man who put on the show could be charged up to 50 times what it cost to rent him for the day. 50 times. Kill one fighter, and you owed his owner a fortune. Suddenly, that thumbs down doesn't look like a gesture of power. It looks like a bankruptcy filing. To understand why death was so expensive, we have to look at what it actually took to make a gladiator. You didn't just grab a man off the street and hand him a shield. A gladiator was a highly specialized, elite athlete, the product of years of intense training and massive capital expenditure. They lived in a ludus, a professional training school that functioned more like a modern, high-security sports academy than a prison. The largest of these, the Ludus Magnus in Rome, was so important it was connected to the Colosseum by an underground tunnel, a dedicated pipeline for breathing assets to move from storage to performance. Inside these walls, the business model was simple: protect and grow the asset. And that started with the food. While the average Roman plebeian was lucky to have a steady supply of grain, gladiators were fed a carefully designed, high-energy diet, supervised by actual nutritionists of the time. They were nicknamed hordearii, or barley men, because they ate a diet heavy in barley and beans. This wasn't because their owners were being cheap. Modern bone analysis of gladiator remains shows bone density and calcium levels higher than almost any other class in Roman society, including the Roman legionnaires. They were bulked up with a layer of subcutaneous fat. Why? Because a layer of fat meant that if a gladiator took a shallow cut, it would bleed profusely, creating the spectacular, gory show the crowd wanted, without damaging the vital organs or the underlying muscle. It was calculated theater. Maximum blood, minimum structural damage. But the real money was spent on the medical staff. The arena didn't just employ doctors. It employed some of the finest medical minds in the ancient world. Galen, arguably the most influential physician in human history, began his career sharpening his skills at a gladiator school in Pergamum. He wasn't there out of mercy. He was there as a loss prevention specialist. Under Galen's care, only 2 gladiators died from their injuries over a 4-year period. Before he arrived, 60 had died under his predecessor. A gladiator school was, in a very real sense, one of the ancient world's most advanced trauma centers, because every healed wound meant the investment could fight again next month. So who owned these men? The business was run by a lanista. In Roman society, the lanista was an outcast, a man of infamia, who occupied the same social status as pimps and sex workers. But he was also an asset manager. His gladiators were his inventory, and he didn't make money by selling them, he made money by leasing them. Think of it like a modern sports franchise or a high-end equipment rental business. If you were a rich Roman politician running for office, you needed a munus, a public show, to buy the love of the people. You didn't own a troupe of fighters. That was too much overhead. Instead, you went to the lanista and rented a roster. The contract was a you break it, you buy it arrangement. The rental fee for a survivor was relatively modest. Let's call it 1 unit of currency. But the fee for a corpse? That was the full purchase price plus a massive penalty. This put the sponsor, the editor, in a terrifying position. He needed the crowd to be excited, and the crowd often screamed for blood. But every time he signaled for a finishing blow, he was writing a check he could barely afford. This massive economic pressure is why mercy was the statistical norm, not the exception. Historical estimates suggest that in the height of the empire, as few as 1 in 10 bouts ended in death. A skilled veteran who survived years of combat was worth 100 times more than a raw recruit, and no rational businessman was going to watch that much capital bleed out for an afternoon's applause. But if gladiators were so valuable, why do we have this image of the arena as a slaughterhouse? Because the arena wasn't one business, it was two businesses sharing the same floor. On one side, you had the star athletes, the protected, expensive investments that owners fought hard to keep alive. But on the other side, there was the damnatio ad bestias and the Noonday Spectacles. These were the condemned criminals, the prisoners of war, and the disposables. The system spent these lives without a second thought because their replacement cost was essentially zero. The Coliseum didn't value human life, it valued the cost of replacing it. A champion lived because he was expensive. A convict died because he was cheap. But how did this asset rental system actually work when the swords were drawn? How did the rules, the referees, and even the armor itself conspire to keep these men alive? To find out, we have to look at the rock, paper, scissors of death. The rock, paper, scissors of death. If you were a Roman editor looking to maximize your profit, you didn't want a fight to end in 3 seconds with a lucky stab to the heart. You wanted drama. You wanted tension. You wanted a narrative that kept 50,000 people on the edge of their seats for 15 minutes. To achieve this, Rome didn't just train fighters, it engineered them. The entire gladiatorial system was built on a rock, paper, scissors logic of asymmetric warfare, where every advantage was balanced by a deliberate, life-threatening weakness. Take the most famous pairing in the history of the arena, the retiarius versus the secutor. The retiarius was the ultimate underdog. He fought nearly naked, wearing only a loincloth and a metal shoulder guard called a gallerus. His only weapons were a weighted net, a 3-pronged trident, and a dagger. He had no helmet to hide his face and no shield to hide behind. In the Roman mind, this made him look vulnerable, almost effeminate, the villain you loved to hate. But his opponent, the secutor, was his perfect mathematical opposite. The secutor was a walking tank. He carried a massive, curved shield that covered him from neck to knee and wore a heavy, smooth helmet. But that helmet was the catch. It was a masterpiece of engineering designed to be a handicap. It had no brim for a net to snag on, and only 2 tiny eye holes to protect him from the trident's prongs. This meant the secutor was nearly blind and quickly ran out of air as he chased his agile opponent around the sand. This wasn't a slaughter. It was a calibrated game of cat and mouse. The retiarius used speed and reach to tire the giant out, while the secutor waited for the one moment his opponent made a mistake to end the fight with a single, powerful charge. By pitting speed against power and reach against protection, Rome ensured that every match was a tactical puzzle. This asymmetry didn't just make the fight interesting, it made it long. And the longer the fight lasted, the more the crowd felt they got their money's worth. But even the best engineered fight can go wrong. A slip in the sand or a broken strap could lead to an accidental death that would cost the sponsor a fortune. This is why the most important person in the arena wasn't the man with the sword. It was the man with the stick. Meet the summa rudis. If you look at ancient mosaics of the Colosseum, you'll see men in white tunics standing right in the middle of the action, holding long wooden rods. These were the professional referees. They weren't just random officials, they were elite retired gladiators who had survived their term of service and won their freedom. They were the only ones in the building who understood exactly how much damage a man could take. The summa rudis had the power to pause the fight at any moment. If a gladiator's armor came loose, the referees stopped the match so it could be fixed. If a fighter was clearly outmatched but fighting bravely, the referee could step in before the final blow was struck. Their job was loss prevention. They were there to make sure the rules of engagement were followed and to prevent the kind of clumsy, unprofessional killing that was bad for business. In a very real sense, the referee was the lanista's insurance policy on the arena floor.
Because when a gladiator survived, the business model entered its most lucrative phase: branding. In ancient Rome, a successful gladiator was more than an athlete. He was a global superstar. They had fan clubs, endorsements, and massive commercial appeal. We find their names and faces on everything from expensive glassware to cheap clay oil lamps, the ancient equivalent of action figures and sports jerseys.
Children played with clay gladiator dolls, just like kids today play with superheroes. The brand of a gladiator was so powerful that it even extended into the cosmetics and pharmaceutical industries. After a fight, vendors would collect the sweat and skin scrapings of the winning gladiators, removed with a metal tool called a strigil, and sell them in small bottles to Roman women. This essence of victory was mixed into face creams and sold as a high-end aphrodisiac, supposedly making the wearer irresistible. Even their blood was a commodity. Roman doctors often prescribed the warm blood of a slain gladiator as a miracle cure for epilepsy. This commercial ecosystem meant that a veteran gladiator like Flama, who fought 34 times and won 21 matches, was an economic engine. Flama was so famous and so wealthy that he was offered his freedom 4 times, and 4 times he turned it down. He chose to stay in the system because, as a free citizen, he would have been just another poor man in a crowded city. But as a gladiator, he was a god. But this brings us to the darkest part of the ledger. If star gladiators were protected like racehorses, who were the people we see being slaughtered in the movies? To understand the true cruelty of Rome, we have to look at the Noonday Spectacles, the intermission where the business model changed from asset management to garbage disposal. The disposable masses and the final bankruptcy. To understand the full picture of the Roman arena, we have to talk about the cheap blood. If the star gladiators were the Ferraris of the ancient world, highly maintained, expensive, and protected, then there was another group of performers who were more like paper plates, used once and thrown away. In the typical schedule of an imperial show, the morning was for animal hunts, and the afternoon was for the elite gladiators. But the time in between, the lunch break, was reserved for the meridiani, or the noonday spectacles. This was the darkest part of the Roman business model. These weren't trained athletes. These were the damnati, condemned criminals and prisoners of war who had been sentenced to death ad ludum, to the gladiator school, or ad bestias, to the beasts. Economically, these people represented a zero-cost asset. Replacing them cost the state nothing, and for the sponsor, renting them was a fraction of the price of a professional fighter. The noonday spectacles were pure, unadulterated homicide. Seneca, the philosopher who actually attended these events, wrote with horror about how these men were sent out without armor or helmets. It wasn't a contest of skill. It was a factory of death. When one man killed his opponent, he was immediately matched with a fresh one until he too was killed. From a management perspective, this was a logical way to clean the inventory. Rome lacked a modern prison system. The arena acted as a high-speed processing center for the state's most unwanted elements. It was a deterrent that paid for itself through ticket sales and political popularity. To add a layer of macabre theater, attendants dressed as Dis, the god of the underworld, and Mercury would enter the arena to drag the bodies away using hooks, testing with heated irons to make sure the assets were truly dead. But if you wanted to see the absolute peak of Roman capital expenditure, you had to wait for a Naumachia, a staged naval battle. This was the Marvel blockbuster of antiquity. To put on a Naumachia, the emperor didn't just rent men, he had to re-engineer the world. Julius Caesar was the first to do it, digging a massive artificial lake in the heart of Rome. Later, Titus flooded the floor of the Coliseum itself. The logistical costs were staggering: thousands of rowers and marines, full-sized warships, and the immense engineering required to move millions of gallons of water in a matter of hours. In AD 52, the Emperor Claudius put on the largest sea battle in history on the Fucine Lake. 19,000 condemned men were forced onto 100 ships. It was a spectacle of such scale that the Roman military had to surround the entire lake with infantry and cavalry just to prevent a mass breakout.
Before the slaughter began, the men famously shouted, "Hail, Emperor, we who are about to die salute you." This line is often attributed to gladiators in movies, but history shows that real professional gladiators would never have said it. They didn't expect to die. Only the damnati, the men on those ships who knew they were disposable, offered that defeatist salute. For nearly 500 years, this business of blood seemed unstoppable. But eventually the ledgers stopped balancing. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, the gladiator industry faced a crisis that no amount of sand could cover up: the collapse of the Roman economy.
First, there was the inflation trap. The cost of maintaining a ludus, school, and importing exotic animals from Africa spiraled out of control. As the value of Roman currency plummeted, the price of a premium-grade gladiator rose to 15,000 sesterces, more than a soldier's annual wage. Marcus Aurelius tried to step in with price controls, but it was like putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound. The real death blow to the games wasn't just mercy or the rise of Christianity. It was a credit crunch. In the late Roman Empire, the Argentarii, the private bankers who provided the loans for sponsors to put on these games, essentially disappeared. Without easy credit, the local politicians in the provinces could no longer afford to rent the elite fighters. The shows became smaller, the star talent became rarer, and the spectacles devolved into cheap executions of criminals. At the same time, the moral compass of the elite was shifting. As the wealthy classes converted to Christianity, they began to view their wealth differently. Instead of spending a fortune on a 6-day bloodbath to win an election, a Christian noble was expected to spend that money on the poor, on hospitals, or on building a church. The ROI of the arena, popularity and political power, was being replaced by the ROI of the afterlife. The arenas didn't disappear overnight. They just slowly emptied out. By the time the Emperor Honorius officially banned the games in the 5th century, the business model was already a ghost of its former self. The magnificent stone amphitheaters that once held 50,000 screaming fans were recycled into fortresses, shops, and even quarries for building materials. So, what is the final lesson of the gladiator business? It teaches us that the Roman Coliseum didn't value human life. It valued the cost of replacing human life. A champion lived because he was expensive. A criminal died because he was cheap. It's a cold, calculating math that we often think we've left in the past. But every time a modern company decides how much to spend on safety or how much an employee's life is worth in a settlement, they are using the exact same ledger that the Lanistas used 2,000 years ago. Rome just had the audacity to write that invoice in blood and make the world cheer while they did the math. The next time you look at the beautiful ruins of the Colosseum, don't just see the arches and the stone. See the spreadsheets. See the rental contracts. And remember that underneath every great spectacle in history, there is always a bill that eventually comes due.